Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Lala. He is Professor of Behavioral and Evolutionary Biology at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He is the author of several books, and today we're going to focus on his latest one, Evolution Evolving the Developmental Origins of Adaptation and Biodiversity. So, Dr. Lala, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I appreciate your interest.
So, just to introduce the topic here, in biology, when looking for explanations for the existence of particular kinds of traits, what different kinds of explanations can we find in different subfields of evolutionary biology?
Well, there are a number of different questions one can ask about a trait. You could ask, what is its adaptive function? That's the kind of question that a behavioral ecologist might ask, for instance. We might focus in on a particular trait. We use the example in the book of the turtle shell. Where did the turtle get its shell? How did it get it? And to a behavioral ecologist, it would be asking, well, what does a shell do for the turtle? And it's, with a little bit of research, we can establish that it provides the turtle with protection. So we're focusing on the adaptive function of the trait, and that can be put to the test in a number of different ways. Other researchers in other spheres of biology ask different kinds of questions. Developmental biologists or Evo-Devo researchers would be more interested in the developmental origins of the shell in the case of the turtle. So how does the trait develop over time in the focal organism? And in this case, you've got the ribs effectively spreading out through the skin to create this carapace, which provides that protection to the turtle. And then you've got paleontologists, for instance, who might be asking much more about the history of the evolutionary history of that particular trait. How did it come to be? From what did that trait evolve? And in the example we use in the book, that's quite an interesting question because, in a way, paleontologists initially made a sort of wrong term. It was perfectly logical to think this way, but they thought because turtles are closely related to crocodiles, and crocodiles have these sort of scaly covering on their back called osteoderms, that most likely the turtle shell evolved out of osteoderms. And so they anticipated that their ancestor would have these osteoderms, and as a consequence neglected what turned out to be a critical fossil that lacked these osteoderms, but also actually lacked a carapace. It lacked a shell on the top of its body altogether, but had a shell on the bottom of its body, on its breastplate, a plastron. And when this subsequently came to light, and the true evolutionary history of turtles was understood, then it became clear that the initial function of the shell was not protection, as the behavioral ecologist had sort of inferred from its current function, but as a digging platform for these turtles. And then only subsequently did this carapace evolve to provide protection. And what's quite nice about that, I think, is it illustrates, firstly, how it's healthy to have these different spheres of biology that are asking different kinds of questions, and collectively they give us a richer understanding of the question, and they can correct each other's errors when those occasionally do occur in the short term. But also they encourage us to ask questions that might not otherwise be asked. So we might think to ourselves, why did the turtles solve the problem of predation with a shell? Why not have big teeth and fight off predators? Why not run away? And by taking this broader perspective, we can get an answer to that kind of question, because it sort of tells us that, well, initially they had this plastron, which was really important for digging, so that kind of prevented growing long legs to run away. And once you have that, then it's really easy, developmentally speaking, and in evolutionary terms, to evolve the same structure in the top half of the body, and so you get that carapace evolving. So multiple perspectives in a science, I think, are extremely healthy.
So at a certain point there, you mentioned developmental biology. Could you tell us a little bit more about that subfield? What is developmental biology, and specifically, in what ways does it relate to evolutionary biology?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because historically there's been a separation of evolutionary and developmental research, and that occurred in around the middle of the last century. You go back to Darwin's day, actually. Darwin was very interested in organisms' development and used things like the study of embryos to provide evidence for evolution. But around the 1920s, 1930s, this separation occurred between these two fields. It began, I think, with the discovery of Mendel's rules for inheritance, and the integration of that Mendelian inheritance with population genetics thinking. And that led to a means for studying evolution without really paying much attention to development. And I suppose that was a very pragmatic line to take at the time. We really didn't know very much about development, and it's horrendously complicated. So, it's not unreasonable of researchers to have taken that pragmatic line. But oftentimes what happens in science is, we make assumptions, and, they're made for good reasons. But then, as Rasmus Winther, philosopher of biology, says, the map becomes the territory. We forget that this is just a model of the world, and it sort of becomes the world, and it becomes almost doctrine that we don't need to know about development to study evolution. And the argument we make in our book, Evolutionary Evolving, is that, well, that's true. You can, to some extent, understand evolution without taking development into account. But if you do take development into account, then you get a better understanding, you get a richer explanation. Now, I guess I've been talking a lot about development. I should perhaps make clear what I mean by that term, because in our book we are using it in quite a broad way. And a lot of people think about development in different ways. For some people, it's all development means building skyscrapers or raising money. Obviously, we're talking about biological development here, but we're also thinking in very broad terms from conception, everything that happens from conception all the way through to death, the whole of ontogeny, in other words. So when I use the term development, and when we use it in the book, we're talking about things like what happens to an adult, how adults behave, how they learn, their culture, their developmental plasticity, all of those kind of things are important in evolution. That's the argument for me.
So at a certain point in the book, you talk about 5 principles of development. Development is modular, development is epigenetic, development is constructive. Then you also talk about the interchangeability of the phenotypic consequences of a change in DNA and the change in internal or external environment. And also one that we could summarize as phenotypic variation being structured and biased. Could you explain those principles?
Yes, that's right. So what we try to do in our book is just in a single chapter sort of summarize. And it's almost an impossible task, but we set out to summarize what an evolutionary biologist or an evolutionary-minded researcher needs to know about development to really do a good job at understanding evolution. And of course, one of our co-authors is a guy called Scott Gilbert, who writes the developmental biology textbooks, and his textbooks, his undergraduate textbooks, are that fat. So there's a huge amount of knowledge that we've kind of condensed down into this single chapter, and then we put it in these 5 little sort of bullet points, just to try and bring home these key points that we want to get across. So firstly, development is modular. That is, it's comprised of sort of building blocks, circuits that are well integrated and have their own independent structure and can be used again and again, a bit like Lego bricks. We can take this bit of developmental kit from over here, from building something, and use it over here in another part of the body to do something else for another function. And that's what evolution has done repeatedly. A lot of evolutionary innovations involve taking circuitry or structures that pre-existed and reusing them in a new context. The insect wing was built from developmental machinery that was initially used to produce insect legs, for instance. So there's this modular structure, which it turns out is really, really important when it comes to understanding evolutionary questions and the introduction of new traits. There's this second feature, which is that development is epigenetic. And we're using epigenetic in the sense of above the level of the gene. So that the control of development is above the level of the gene. And that stands in marked contrast, I think, to how many people think about development and how it's often portrayed in the media, like there's a genetic program where all of the information is stored and that's read out, and there's this kind of unfolding of this instructions for building a body and instructions for how that organism should behave and so forth. We take issue with that characterization of development. It's much more open-ended, it's much more flexible, and the control, the regulation of the outputs, the phenotypes, the traits of the organism is at a higher level than the genes. It's at the level of a sort of regulatory network of, yes, there's genes involved, but there's a whole bunch of other molecular outputs and signals and environmental inputs, which collectively influence the structure of the trait. And that perspective helps us to account for another one of the characteristics of development that we placed emphasis on, which is this interchangeability of genetic and environmental inputs. Because both genes and environments feed into the regulatory machinery of development, they're all processed by the same mechanisms. So you can get the same phenotypic outputs arising from a genetic mutation or an environmental change. We also emphasize how development is constructive. That is, it is critically dependent on the organism itself. The organism is an active player in its own development. One of my intellectual heroes, Richard Lewontin, describes both evolution and development as a bit like walking on a trampoline. As you move, you deform the surface, and then you influence your own trajectory subsequently. We give a nice example in the book of this, which involves these dung beetles. So these dung beetles, the mother beetle will build a brood ball out of dung and place an egg inside it and insert also a little package of her symbionts inside, and then bury that underground. And then the infant, when it hatches, will consume the pedestal, thereby getting the mother's symbionts. It will then feed on the brood ball. It will defecate. It will mix the materials, and in the process, it will distribute all the bacteria, all the symbionts that it got from its mother throughout the brood ball. And those bacteria then go to work in processing all the chitin and lignin and making the carbon nutrients available to the offspring to consume. So it's effectively producing more of its own food. And experiments which have been carried out, where you cancel the effects of the organism's activities and the mother's activities, show that it really does make a difference. If you don't have that modification of your environment, but both the mother and the larvae are engaging in, then the larvae will engage, will develop in a completely different way. It will be much more likely to be non-viable. It will grow to a far lesser extent. It won't become sexually dimorphic. It will be quite different as an organism. So the form of the phenotype that you end up with, the suite of traits that you come to possess, depends very much on what you do as an organism. You control, you influence your own development. And then there's this last point, which is that developmental processes are biased. They're biased in the sense that certain phenotypes, certain traits, certain combinations of traits are far more likely to be produced in development than others. And that, as we see, as we emphasize in the book, has a major importance to how we understand the action of natural selection. The selection that ensues is biased by the variation that's available to it.
So another question then, what do you mean when you say that the evolutionary process itself evolves?
Yeah, so to understand this, I think we need to take a closer look at natural selection. I mean, what we're trying to understand ultimately in the book is how adaptive evolution takes place. So how organisms acquire adaptations, how we get speciation and diversity, the diversity of life that we see. And we, of course, always explain that with natural selection. And that's usually as far as it goes, but one can look a little bit closer at how natural selection works. We can break it down into its component parts, if you like. And that, I think, is an instructive exercise. So biologists and philosophers have recognized for some time that in order to get evolution by natural selection, you need three things. You need some process which is generating variation, phenotypic variation in the traits that an organism exhibits. You need differences amongst them in their ability to reproduce, to survive and reproduce, fitness differences. And you need to pass on those qualities from one generation to the next. You need inheritance in some form. Phenotypic variation, fitness differences, inheritance. If you've got those three things, natural selection should ensue. But in principle, you could apply those to the cultural evolution of the bicycle, right? It doesn't have to be about biology. It doesn't have to be satisfied in that way. Anything that has those three properties could evolve and produce adaptation. However, evolutionary biologists since the 1950s have had a particular way of interpreting that algorithm. And it's a genetic view, a genetic vision of natural selection. So when we think about phenotypic variation, we tend to focus in on the variation that arises from random genetic mutations. Yeah, mutations that arise at random with respect to their functionality. And those are the ones which we think are really, really important in evolution. And when it comes to fitness differences, well, we envisage that natural selection is sorting between genes and genotypes, and that's what really counts. And when it comes to inheritance, we focus in on genetic inheritance, on the passive transmission of genes from parent to offspring. So there's this genetic take on how natural selection works. But in practice, organisms can satisfy those requirements for natural selection in other ways. So to give you just one example, because it's a complicated issue, we can see how many organisms have extra genetic forms of inheritance. In the case of humans, we have cultural inheritance, whereas in the case of plants, they have epigenetic inheritance. Many animals inherit symbionts and so forth. So those forms of inheritance in principle can satisfy natural selection, requirements for natural selection. And so when we start to look more closely we can actually see how developmental processes are in different ways biasing the variation that's produced, the phenotypic variation that's produced, modifying the nature of the fitness differences that the organisms have through their interactions with their environment, and modifying the nature of inheritance. And every organism does it in their own particular way because it depends on their own personal characteristics. Plants don't have culture, so they can't do culture inheritance, but killer whales can, humans can. So the characteristics of natural selection, the way it works for any given organism, and we give plenty of examples in the book, depends on the properties of the organism. Natural selection depends on the properties of the organism. Well, then it follows that as organisms evolve, the evolutionary process evolves.
So you've touched very slightly on this topic in just the previous answer, but what is developmental bias? What does that mean in the context of developmental biology?
Yeah, so developmental bias is a relatively simple idea. It's the idea that the variation, the phenotypic variation, the traits that organisms have, or the combinations of traits that arise in development, is biased, so that some traits or some combinations of traits are far more likely to arise in development than others. And the significance of that is that that bias is the action of natural selection and influences the patterns of variation that we see out there in the world. I can explain it with an analogy, if you like. So imagine you're traveling and you stay in a hotel and you go down for breakfast to the restaurant where they have a buffet, and they're serving two kinds of eggs, fried eggs and scrambled eggs. But in this restaurant, the chef is able to produce scrambled eggs at 10 times the rate he produces fried eggs. And you look around the restaurant and you see pretty much everybody is eating scrambled eggs, right? So there are two kinds of explanations that might account for that. One is a selective kind of explanation. It could be that everybody preferred scrambled eggs and they chose it. That's kind of equivalent to the traditional way in which we might explain the variation that we see in nature. But there's another possibility, which is that the scrambled eggs were just produced so much more frequently than the fried eggs that people were constrained to just eat scrambled eggs. That was what was available. And that's also a potential explanation. And more likely, what's going on in the restaurant is a combination of those two things. And that's what we think is more likely explanation for the variation that we see in the world, that it's a combination of developmental bias and selection, which accounts for the patterns that we see in nature. But in the book, we do give some really quite interesting and compelling examples of how, through studying developmental mechanisms, you can predict what biases will arise and what patterns of variation should be observed. And then you go and look in nature and you see that's exactly the pattern. So you can actually, to some extent, often predict the variation that arises in nature by what arrives in development, what arrives in the first place, and the rate in which it does so.
So developmental biology, if I understand it correctly, can help explain why some adaptations exist and others do not, and why some characters are more evolvable than others, right?
Exactly. And, historically, of course, evolutionary biologists have sort of seen some role, a limited role for developmental biology and evolutionary explanation. So more commonly, rather than talking of bias, we talk about developmental constraint. And, we take issue with that as a kind of explanatory tool. We suggest that's probably not the optimal way to think about these issues. And the problem is that if you think in terms of developmental constraints, then the constraints, the developmental aspects, can account for why development does not occur. Why evolution does not occur, or why adaptation does does not arise. The kind of thinking that we often encounter is that, traits are either possible to produce in development or not. They're not possible to produce. That's because of developmental constraints. And that explains why we don't have, humans with wings, for instance. Developmental biology, never throws up humans with wings. So because that's kind of impossible to produce for various reasons, then that's kind of a constraint. That explains why we don't have that. But if you want to understand all the things we do have, natural selection is the answer, right? That would be the traditional way of understanding it. And the problem with that reasoning is it's all or nothing. It's categorical, rather than thinking probabilistically about the likelihood of particular variation being produced, which is actually much more realistic. And when you think about things in probabilistic terms, that there's certain patterns of variation that are far more likely to arise than others, then you can see that those developmental processes are not just providing an explanation for the stuff that we don't have, they're also contributing to the explanation for the things that we do have as well. Like I explained with the example of the scrambled egg and consumption in the restaurant. Oh, to come back to you also ask about evolvability.
Mm-hmm.
So evolvability refers to the ability of an organism to evolve, the capacity to evolve. Or, we can think more fine-grained about the capacity of the traits of an organism to evolve. And what's been quite interesting over recent years is the observation that organisms vary in how good they are at evolving. And even if we look in a single organism, we can see considerable variation in how likely their traits are to evolve. So there's been a lot of research into this in recent years, both empirical and theoretical, and these studies show quite clearly that the capacity to evolve can itself evolve over time. And that as organisms, as they evolve, they will encounter certain features in their environment, certain patterns of variation, and will produce outputs that either satisfy those requirements for the environment or don't. And this will lead to selection on the relationships between traits. It will lead to pleiotropy, it will lead to epistatic interactions, such that combinations of traits that are usefully produced together are more readily produced. Combinations of traits that are less usefully put together are less reliably produced. And the net result is you end up with some traits being more evolvable than others. Again, let me try and give you an example to make it more concrete. So imagine you have a quadruped, an animal with 4 legs, and mutations could arise in any one of those legs, which would lengthen it or shorten it. But of course, if you have an animal with 3 legs that are longer than one, or 1 leg that's longer than the others, that's not particularly useful variation. And so we can envisage that over long periods of time, natural selection will favor mutations that lead to epistatic interactions that reinforce symmetry between the legs, that eradicate the situations where asymmetries arise and robustly produce symmetry. It would favor pleiotropy, so that any change in the characteristics of a leg will also affect other legs. And so that gradually over time, the likelihood of a mutation producing asymmetrical leg length would be reduced. Now, mutations are still occurring at random, even after that long period of time, and they can still increase the length of the legs or decrease the length of the legs. independently of what would be beneficial for the organism in that environment. So it's not on demand as such. But nonetheless, variation that's kind of been useful in the past, that's got that symmetrical quality, is favored, is much more evolvable. It's much easier to evolve symmetrical characters over time that will change more quickly than variation that generates asymmetrical correspondences between the legs. Those will be far less likely to arise and will be less evolvable. So you can see how, it's a sort of hypothetical example, but it illustrates how these combinations between traits can arise over time to produce variation that fits with what was useful in the past.
Great, but then there's an important question to ask here, I guess. In regards to the developmental processes themselves, where do they stem from? Are they the result of natural selection?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in a way it's a kind of key hang up for many people in embracing the kind of developmental perspective that I and my co-authors advocate in the book. Um, the way of thinking that is very widespread and is a kind of mental block to embracing it is that we will happily explain developmental bias through earlier natural selection. So if we see that there's developmental bias taking place, there's a bias in the production of the phenotypic variation to produce certain forms more readily than others, we'll say, oh, well, the reason we have that is because of earlier natural selection. And they'll stop there. What they won't consider is that earlier natural selection was also subject to biased developmental variation. And in fact, you could trace it back all the way to the beginning of life, and there'd always be biased developmental variation, which would be subject to natural selection. There's actually a reciprocal causal relationship between these characters. There's biased variation being produced in development, and then natural selection occurs on that bias, sorting between that bias variation, influencing the bias in the next generation. And so we have to think about things in this reciprocal causal way. And that means we can account for the patterns of variation that we see in nature in terms of these dual processes, natural selection and developmental bias, rather than tracing everything back to natural selection. And that I think is the logical distinction. There you're going to a linear causal model as opposed to a reciprocal causal model.
Could you explain the phenomenon of plasticity-led evolution, or the ways by which developmental responses to environmental change can direct genetic change?
Sure, yeah. So this is an idea that's come to prominence in recent years through the important work of Mary Jane West Eberhardt, who published a now classic volume in 2003, Developmental Plasticity and Evolution. And it's a very, very rich book indeed. But one thing that people have sort of latched onto is her suggestion that genes can be followers rather than leaders in evolution, that organisms can respond to environmental challenges plastically through changes in their development, which adjust their behavior, their phenotype, their traits to the environmental conditions. And then subsequently over many generations, that can be stabilized through genetic change. So plasticity comes first, subsequently genetic change occurs. So that's the basic idea. An example that we use in the book concerns blind Mexican cavefish, Astyonyx mexicanus. So these are really fascinating. When these fish were first discovered in the 1930s, they looked so strikingly different from all known fishes that they were classified as entirely new genus. Only for subsequent science to establish that sighted versions of the same species were incredibly widespread in the rivers and streams of Mexico and southern USA. And it's since been established that there are about 35 at the last count independently evolving populations of these blind Mexican cavefish. They all have a very similar suite of traits. They're typically, of course, blind or eyeless. They will have changes in the pigmentation. They'll be quite white, but a whole suite of changes in their bone structure, in their metabolism, in their behavior, all kinds of things. And also some really, intriguing features, like virtually all the populations have got fragmented bones in their faces, literally broken up bones. And, the researchers who study this have been sort of puzzled by, why is it that they should all have this feature? It seems so random, and it's hard to understand prima facie why they should have this not obviously beneficial, probably maladaptive characteristic, and why it should repeatedly have evolved. The fact that it repeatedly evolves suggests that some adaptive value. So there's this suite of traits associated with blind Mexican cavefish, but some of them are a little bit sort of odd. And light was thrown on the issue when a team of researchers took the riverfish, the sighted versions of the same species, and reared them in the dark and the cold to simulate sort of cave, being thrust into the cave environment. And the offspring of those fish developed a suite of characteristics that is strikingly similar to the blind Mexican cavefish, the derived form. And if you look at which traits change in response to the dark and the cold, they're the same kind of traits as we see have evolved in the derived form of the fish. And they respond to the dark and the cold, often by producing increased phenotypic variation. And if, as researchers have done, you select on some of that increased phenotypic variation, you see a response to selection in the same direction. So those kind of studies and various other kinds of experimentation present, I think, a very strong case that what has happened in these fishes is that they respond initially to this challenge of being in a very dark, cold place, plastically through the developmental change, and then gradually over time that becomes stabilized, and you get refinements through genetic evolution. And some of the odd features, like the broken up bones, it turns out that you can then start to understand why they have those features, because there's a strong correlation between the number of neuromasts that they have, which are these cells which allow them to detect water currents, which is really important if you're foraging in the dark, and this fragmentation. So certain things come to light when you take this developmental perspective.
Mm-hmm. You've done work on niche construction specifically. So could you tell us about it? What is niche construction?
Niche construction is the capacity of organisms to modify their environments and thereby sort of modify the natural selection that their population experiences. And this is a very sort of obvious and prosaic thing that, every kid knows that birds construct nests, as do fishes. The ants and bees will construct mounds, and that not just artifacts. You'll see, everybody knows that plants are modifying wind speeds and affecting shade and playing a role in the hydrological cycle, or the cycling of nutrients, and so on and so forth. So to greater and lesser degree, of course, all organisms will modify their local environments, and sometimes this will feed back to influence the selection that they experienced. And from a traditional perspective, no one would kind of dispute that goes on, but people don't really see that niche construction as playing a causal role in evolution. It's something that has evolved, that we can understand as having evolved through natural selection, an interesting feature of the organisms, but we don't see it as part of the process. It's not part of our explanation for how or whether or the nature of the evolution that takes place. But let me go back to an example to illustrate why it might be better if we thought about niche construction as playing a causal role. I'll go back to the example I talked about of the dung beetles, because of these dung beetles are kind of classic niche constructors. When the mother builds that brood ball out of dung, and when she inserts the egg in it and adds in her little pedestal, which contains her symbionts, and when she buries it underground, where it's in a sort of safe, thermally buffered environment, that's niche construction on her part. And when the offspring consumes the pedestal and mixes the materials and builds a pupation chamber and distributes the symbionts in ways that allow them to process the the carbon nutrients, make them available for its own growth, that is also niche construction on the part of the larvae. And what experimenters were able to show, who have carried out experiments that either allow that niche construction to take place or prevent it from taking place and allow that comparison, is that not only does the niche construction make a critical difference to the development of individual organisms, which traits evolve, but it affects which traits become statistically associated with other traits. So it generates new clusters of traits. For instance, niche constructing traits on both the mother and the larvae's part get statistically associated and subsequently co-evolve with traits that respond plastically to the constructed environment. Yeah, so things like horn length, and it's very contingent on the activities of the organ, the niche constructing activities. So the cluster of traits that's most significantly associated with biological fitness changes as a result of this niche construction. And what that means is, through their niche construction, organisms are affecting the direction that natural selection takes. Yeah. So what the niche construction is doing is effectively shifting the traits that are associated with biological fitness and therefore modifying the direction of natural selection. That's something that we need to take account of if we want to understand how a population will evolve and get a better understanding on why it evolves in the way that it does. I mean, I think part of the problem historically has been that evolutionary biologists, when we seek to understand evolution, we'll kind of start with selection pressures. We'll examine a system in a laboratory or in nature, and we'll find that this genotype has got higher fitness than that genotype, and then we'll come up with an evolutionary explanation retrospectively for why that should be. But our analysis starts with fitness differences, and then when we know there's fitness differences, we can make predictions about how traits will evolve and what the outcomes will be. But we tend not to ask, where did those fitness differences come from? And so what a developmental perspective can give us is an answer to that question. In this case, the niche construction was really critical for creating those selection pressures.
So could you tell us about the concept of dynamic adaptive landscapes and why it is important in the context of your book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so adaptive landscapes are a kind of conceptual tool that evolutionary biologists use to think about and sometimes also to sort of model biological evolution. And oftentimes they'll envisage a surface like a landscape, which if you think in 3 dimensions, you could have 2 dimensions, the X and Y axis, if you like, which represent 2 different traits or 2 different genotypes. And then the vertical axis would represent the fitness. And so you can plot a a population of individuals on that surface, and if you know the values of the traits of that individual with respect to those two dimensions, you can see where they are at any point in time, and you predict that they would move up this fitness surface to the highest fitness point, or at least that's the traditional expectation. But what's recent research, particularly studying sort of developmental bias, but also plasticity and niche construction, has shown, formal mathematical models has established that these assumptions that you can always travel up to the sort of local fitness peak does not always occur, does not always realized because of the developmental bias in the system. And what developmental processes are doing is effectively creating viable pathways across that landscape. So what natural selection actually does is push populations along paths created by developmental processes. And what other developmental processes like plasticity, like niche construction are doing is deforming the surface so that as the populations evolve, that surface is not static, it's dynamic. And hills might appear or dips in the surface might appear as a result of the organism's own activities, which will influence the direction of its evolution. So we need to take account of these developmental factors again if we're going to understand the adaptive evolution of the population.
And in what ways can development contribute to evolutionary innovation?
Well, there are a number of ways. The most obvious way I've already briefly mentioned, which is that there's this modular structure to development, and what that effectively represents is pre-established bits of useful kit that can be reused and repurposed for new roles in development and in evolution. So I mentioned the example of the origins of insect wings, which are thought to have evolved by reusing some of the circuitry associated with the production of insect legs. You can then go further and say, where did beetle horns come from? Well, beetle horns actually came through the repurposing of some of the, regulatory circuitry that underlie the development of insect wings. So, all the time you're sort of reusing these pre-established tools, these circuits, these, networks, which have got, useful functions. You don't have to do everything from scratch. And one consequence of that is it's a further introduction of developmental bias into the system, because if you're using the same bit of kit again and again, then any mutations that occur, any changes in the operation of those will affect multiple traits or multiple functionalities in the organism. And so biases arise in the evolution of the system.
And this is an additional question. Can adding a developmental perspective to evolutionary biology also help understand how certain traits vary in different ways across different lineages?
Yes. I think one has to think about things from a species-specific perspective, because as I mentioned earlier, the characteristics of the individual organism will determine, how this system will evolve and the nature of the evolutionary dynamic. So one of the consequences of the sort of traditional view that natural selection is just natural selection, if the only thing that sort of affects the production of phenotypic variation that matters in evolution is genetic mutation, and that occurs at random with respect to function. And if traits are inherited primarily through the transmission of genes in a passive way from parent to offspring without introducing any sort of biases in the transmission process, then all the direction in adaptive evolution comes from differences in fitness between individuals in a particular environmental context. And that applies equally to fruit flies, yeast, mice, oak trees, and humans. We all evolve in the same way. Conversely, if you recognize, as we do, that developmental processes bias the variation that's subject to natural selection, they influence which cluster of traits is statistically associated with fitness and therefore the direction of selection, and they affect the nature of inheritance. They change how traits are inherited from one generation to the next. Then each trait of each organism evolves in its own idiosyncratic way, and you need to take account of that developmental knowledge in order to be able to understand the evolutionary dynamics for that system. And this is, I think, particular implications for our understanding of human evolution, because humans don't evolve like fruit flies and yeast. And for the longest time, of course, there's been a great deal of conflict, particularly in North America, between evolutionary biologists and creationist kind of explanations. And this is a very complicated issue, and there are multiple reasons for why people might sometimes be resistant to taking on board evolutionary explanations. But I think as a community of scientists, we have a responsibility to at least consider the possibility that sometimes our explanations might appear a little bit thin. And if we're saying that humans evolve in exactly the same way that yeast evolves, that might not be credible to many members of the public. Conversely, I think if one recognizes that humans don't evolve in the same way as fruit flies and oak trees, because we develop differently, because we interact with the world differently, and because we inherit valuable resources differently, then it potentially leads us to richer explanations for human evolution.
So talking about humans, I would like to explore now an example of how development and extra genetic inheritance apply to humans. So could you tell us about the evolution of the human brain and cognition?
Sure. So I guess the thing that's really, really striking about the human brain compared with other primates is its sheer size. It's 3 times the size of chimpanzees, 3 times the number of neurons, roughly speaking. And, the relationship between brain size and cognitive capability is a very complicated one, which, is probably beyond the realms of this conversation to sort of go into. But, I think it's fair enough to say other things being held equal, if we're not making comparisons across vastly different taxonomic groups where the brains are organized in very different ways, by and large, you've got a bigger brain, it allows you more processing power. More neurons lead to greater processing power, other things being held equal. But there's a catch when it comes to that, which is that brains are incredibly expensive organs. There's a huge energy budget associated with the human brain, which humans are willing to pay, but other apes and other primates, by and large, do not pay, even though they themselves often have very large brains relative to other mammals. So that raises the question of how has it been possible for humans to afford this big brain? Well, where does the energy come from? It comes from food. We get our food by foraging, and in order to evolve a larger brain, an organism would have to either forage more efficiently or make savings in other tissues that allow it to invest more of its energy budget in its brain. Now, humans have been able to do both, and they've been able to do both because they have this extraordinary capacity for extra genetic inheritance in the form of our culture. So if one looks at primates in general, particularly great apes, but also particularly humans, we see that the really high return foods that are consumed, the high energy budget foods, often require a great deal of resource to capture, to process in various ways, and then to consume. So think of nuts that have got protective shells. Think of invertebrates that need to be caught. Think of vertebrates that are even more challenging to catch. Think of resources like honey, with a whole series of steps that you have to engage in order to access it in an effective way without getting stung to death and so on. So that what's actually really well established, I think, from studies of behavioral development in primates, is that these more challenging foods to acquire, but which are energy rich, are typically learned socially. Animals, primates acquire these skills through imitation and other forms of observational learning. And there's actually legions of evidence that supports that claim now across a broad range of species, including humans. And we can see, if we take a comparative perspective, correlations between the breadth of an animal's diet, the richness of an animal's diet, the extent of its reliance on social learning, the extent of its reliance on tool use, because often to acquire these foods you have to use tools, the extent of extractive foraging. These traits, this cluster of traits, tends to have co-evolved. Again, we see evidence for a developmental bias, the cluster of traits co-evolving. So you've got smart primates like chimpanzees and orangutans, of course humans fall into that bracket, who are good at all of those things, good at tool use, good at social learning, good at extractive foraging, very broad diets, and other primates, nocturnal prosimians, for instance, that are less good at all of those things. So what's going on? So that's the more cognitive side. So what's going on with the brain? Well, actually, it turns out you can make sense of quite a lot of the variation in brain size across primates through, including variation in the individual components of the brain, through variation in the whole brain size. Yeah. So the whole brain evolves in a concerted way. It either sort of all gets bigger, all gets smaller, and that typically happens through extending the period of neurogenesis. You just kind of cook the brain for longer in development. And that means that certain structures like the neocortex and various other features get disproportionately large. So the point I was going to make was the capacity to grow that brain is critically reliant on culturally acquired knowledge. Without that form of extra genetic inheritance, you wouldn't be able to generate the energy to cook that brain for longer and support such a large brain. But then once you have that large brain, it provides you with the cognitive processing power to support all of the complex learning and behavior that you're utilizing in a sort of dynamical feedback way. So that's one side. But then there's also this developmental bias, which is playing a role in showing how the brain areas are evolving in a concerted way, and that similar kind of coevolution of traits is occurring at the behavioral level. And then when it comes to the way we process our foods, we cook our food, we chop our food, we mash our food, we pound our foods. All of those activities are in various different ways, breaking down the proteins and making the food easier to extract the nutrients and the resources. We're effectively externalizing part of the digestive process. And because we've externalized the digestive process, we don't need such large guts in order to process the foods that we consume internally. And so we can make energy savings on our gut that can be invested in our brains. So what has happened is effectively, we, through our culture and through our developmental bias, have shifted the balance from a primate that was reliant on a relatively large gut and a relatively small brain to a primate that is reliant on a relatively large brain and a relatively small gut.
Great. So I have one last question I would like to ask you. I know that you are a proponent of the extended evolutionary synthesis. So could you tell us about that and what are the main differences between the modern evolutionary synthesis and the extended evolutionary synthesis? And in what ways do you think basically that evolutionary theory needs to be reframed?
Sure. So the extended evolutionary synthesis you can think of as just another way to think about evolution. It's a conceptual framework. It's perhaps best thought of as a revised structure or understanding to how we explain evolution. As I've described earlier, the traditional way of thinking about evolution, the way that's dominated evolutionary biology for at least 100 years, has been very sort of gene-centric, gene-focused. That doesn't mean to say, of course, evolutionary biologists don't study phenotypes. Of course they do. They study the traits of organisms in a variety of different ways. But the explanations that they give, are heavily reliant on genes and gene frequency change. Evolution is changing gene frequencies. That's how it's often defined. We track evolution through population genetic models or quantitative genetic models. So genes and their change over time are how we make sense of, interpret evolution. And the extended evolutionary synthesis you can view as one of, I think of it as a kind of umbrella concept. It's in many ways cognitively linked to, it has cognate links with other organism-centered approaches to evolution, like some aspects of Evo-Devo, like Eco-Devo, like developmental systems theory or niche construction theory. There are a number of movements or subfields of biology that place the organism center stage in evolution and place emphasis on the active agency of the organism and how development matters in evolution. And the extended evolutionary synthesis is really just a sort of umbrella term for all of those things. And when when in our book we talk about evolution evolving, we don't really characterize it as an extended evolutionary synthesis book, but that's what it is. But it's equally a book for advocates of Evo-Devo and Eco-Devo and developmental systems theory. We try and champion all of those approaches, and they are distinctive because of their emphasis on things like niche construction, emphasizing how niche construction is important, the active agency of organisms is important, that plasticity-led evolution is frequently important, that extragenetic inheritance is occurring in a variety of different ways, and that makes a difference to how populations evolve, that developmental bias is a really central concept, and so we have this reciprocal causal framework to our understanding of evolutionary change, and that the evolutionary process itself evolves over time. This is emphasis on evolvability. So all of these are ideas that are central to the extended evolutionary synthesis, that are central to our book, but also central to a variety of organism-centered approaches, which I think are gaining traction currently.
Great. So the book is again Evolution Evolving, the Developmental Origins of Adaptation and Biodiversity. There it is.
There it is.
I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Lala, apart from the book, just before we go, are there any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Yeah, we actually have a website associated with the book, evolutionaryevolving.com. And if you go to that website, you can see a number of other resources, not just information about the book, but we've produced some animations which will, in 2, 3, 5 minutes, give you overviews of how developmental plasticity works or the nature of extragenetic inheritance. And I think these are really cool educational resources in their own right. So I encourage you to take a look at those. Thank you.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I appreciate your interest.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.